my name is Elizabeth Palafox. I'm the lead clinician with the Canenta San Antonio office. And today we will be going over our Sobremesa Chat around grief.
Yeah, and I'm Hilda McClure. I'm the COO of Connected Center. And I feel bittersweet about today's conversation. Grief is such a hard one.
Mhm, mhm. It's one that's important because it can be, I think, just socially one that we try to like push to the side or kind of
Mm,
move through quickly. So to kind of sit and have a conversation about this specific topic is important, but I know it can bring up different things.
sure, for sure. And I think like kind of moving into May and then June with Mother's Day and Father's Day, I think grief can become extra big for folks, right?
Mhm.
Like you go to church and they have a Mother's Day service.
Yes.
Father's Day services, I think, are a little bit more complicated, but but they're it's just very present. We went to the store last night, and they have all the Mother's Day stuff out and all the Father's Day stuff out, and
Mm,
um, so I think like this is feels like a really great time to talk about grief. I think the holidays is also another time for
yeah.
grief.
Hmm.
Um, but there's something I think about Mother's Day and Father's Day that really shows the lack
Hmm. Hmm.
if you've had a parent who's passed away.
Yeah.
So today we're going to kick off the conversation with we're just going to talk about the different types of grief that kind of exist and give examples and maybe I have had my own grief in my own life, and I'm sure Elizabeth you've had grief in your own life too, so maybe some of that will come out too, just talking about our own grief. But I think that when we talk about grief, people don't realize how prevalent it is, and two, how it can take on a lot of different shapes. Or sometimes I'll even see in my counseling room that people don't think grief should exist in a space, in like a certain kind of space or a certain kind of situation. And really my experience and finding has been is that grief exists in a lot of different ways that we sometimes don't expect, and is probably more prevalent than we even realize in our lives. I think we typically think about it just like if someone dies, but as we're going to talk about here in a second, it actually exists in many different places.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, maybe we can talk a little bit about the again, like with grief, sometimes it can feel really individualized. And so we can talk about how it can also be a community impact. And like you were saying, Hilda, just all the different, how multifaceted it can be. So we will start with this concept of collective or communal grief that can come from a shared loss or an experience of loss. And as we were preparing for the chat today, top of mind is the pandemic, where I mean, one, there was real loss of lives. There was a lot of real grief of family members, friends, community members. And that's one thing. And then on top of that, there was a loss of connection, loss of jobs, and this isolation, right? And even talking to some people, young adults, loss of milestone experiences like prom and graduation. I know a lot of weddings or travel had to be put on hold. So it's almost this thing that everybody was feeling
Mhm.
and experiencing at the same time. So that's one pretty clear example of a collective grief.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
anything else that you would add to that?
Yeah, I would like when celebrities die. I think we see it
Mm,
too. Like I
nice.
remember when, for example, Kobe Bryant passed
Mm.
away, or more recently, oh my gosh, I can only think of her show name.
Catherine O'Hara.
Catherine O'Hara. Yeah, when she passed away, those that know the show Schitt's Creek, I think that was like a communal thing. Or when the Queen passed away a couple years ago in the UK. Oh, another one that felt like super devastating was Chad Boswick. And he
Yes.
died during the pandemic, not from
Yeah.
COVID, but
Mm-hmm.
so sometimes that can be, go ahead.
I was just gonna say yes, that even something like that where I know recently with Catherine O'Hara, people were like, why do I feel so sad about this? I didn't know her. Um, like why is it actually affecting me? And it is her as a person, obviously, but also what she may have represented. And so it's also these connections we have to people or concepts or situations that when it's no longer there, it almost feels like a piece of you is also not there anymore. And that's real. It's not being dramatic. Sometimes it's also a way to work through something from like a previous experience or a previous loss.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I also think that it can be like world events.
Hmm.
So we've been talking about like people, I mean, we've talked about COVID as a world event, but I think like that was like something that happened really personally to a lot of us. But
Hmm.
even I think about when people lose elections that you've been rooted for,
Hmm. Hmm.
or the January 6th taking over of the Capitol, right? Watching on TV as that happened, or 9/11, which that obviously impacted people personally. But even, I mean, I remember it like it was yesterday. I was in fifth grade. I was in Puerto Rico, not an ocean across, and there being a collective and communal grief about kind of those events, or the wars that are happening, or anything like that can also bring about this like feeling of sadness and grief.
Hmm. Yeah. Another type of grief that um, some might not typically consider, but it is anticipatory grief. And this is when there is maybe somebody's been given a prognosis, right, that outlines maybe a timeline, right, of how much um, almost like this is how much time you have left, or it's especially we say with chronic illness or medical conditions, it's this feeling of things will soon be different. Kind of
Yeah.
that's comes down to things will soon be different. And this one's very like all grief, this one's complicated too because you have the person with you, but as you're moving through that piece and like living through that piece, there's also this coming to terms with what might this look like in the future. Um, and I don't know if there's anything you'd want to add to that one.
Um, I think that that can also look like, your job is
Mm,
closing down,
yeah.
or there's a merger, or a coworker is going to leave
Yes.
um, your work, and so you're in a final countdown for that.
Mm-hmm.
I think it can look like you're about to sell a house you
Mm-hmm.
love, and it is going to be different, or your friend is moving away,
Mm-hmm.
and you know that there's like a finality or like a change coming.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, and I think that this one we don't give enough space or credit for, because I think people are really quick to say like, "Oh, they're here in the present,"
Yeah. Enjoy the
and
time you have. Yeah.
yeah, and also they're on limited time. They are,
Mhm.
like, yeah, I'm gonna be without a job or
Yeah.
whatever. I just watched a clip this morning actually about Eric Dane. It's
Yes.
That was
Yeah.
a hard one. And so, if you're or unfamiliar with Eric Dane, he was McSteamy on Grey's Anatomy, and he was diagnosed with ALS about 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, and it was
Mhm.
actually a very, very quick,
Yeah.
um, very, very quick, like from diagnosis
Yeah.
to passing away. And so he does He left a clip for his daughters, but I think that one of the threads I felt that I kind of understood was like this kind of anticipatory grief around passing away and not living, to the extent he thought he was going to live.
Right.
Um, and so I don't know that we talk about it enough.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's also overlap between a lot of these. Um, and as you were describing some of the other examples, that also leads to ambiguous grief. So, for example, it's not grief related to death, but it's grief still related to loss of some kind. And you mentioned moving away, life transitions, another one, breakups, separation of homes, um, transitions in identity, right? So ambiguous grief can be kind of this almost umbrella term for any change, any transition, any loss, that maybe is not death related.
Yeah.
Um, and really that can look like so many things, but those come to mind, even you mentioned like selling something, like maybe your first car, um, giving away, things that were important to you in childhood. Um, even good things like going to college, getting married, having a child. That's one I hear. So I don't have children, but that's one I hear often is first-time moms will talk about, grieving who they were, while also celebrating who they are becoming. And that's, it's an ambiguous grief of I will never be that person again. And also there's excitement about the future. But it still comes with that, what
Yeah.
life may have looked like before a big change.
Yeah. That's a good one, the one about becoming a mom for the first time. And I think we did, I don't think we clarified this very well, but I'm going to just add this in. I think grief is always, not always, I think it's often associated with something being like bad, like grief is
Mhm.
bad, like we
Mhm.
shouldn't grieve. And when in reality, grief is typically a sign that there was like lots of love involved.
Yeah.
And that's why there's grief. We don't grieve things we don't love or we don't care about,
Right.
right? Like there are, of course, there are like stars, for example, that have passed away that haven't impacted me. And it's not that it's not sad. Of course it's sad, but there's not necessarily like that collective grief because
Right.
it's not necessarily something I feel like care or love or etc.
Hmm.
about.
Hmm.
Um, and so when we think about like becoming a mom for the first time, it's like, wow, I have so much appreciation for who I was and for that version of myself and so much love and so that causes grief while also celebrating that I
Yeah.
have this little human. It's a good, it's good. Um, and that on the kind of the flip side of that, we have traumatic grief. And so traumatic grief is grief that comes, I mean, kind of to the name when there's like a trauma involved. So that can be like a sudden death, a traumatic death. So typically those go hand in hand, sudden and traumatic. But that can also be like if someone has like a chronic illness and then at the end it just gets really, really bad, that can be traumatic,
Mhm.
that can cause traumatic grief.
Yeah.
Um, and kind of like you mentioned, there can be overlap because I think about like even with my own grief story around my mother-in-law, who I've talked about prior, I think there was like a collective grief because it was like due to COVID, and there were some parts of it that were like very actually deeply traumatic.
Mhm.
And so there's like like twofold there. Um, Traumatic grief can also be around like things that happen in our countries
Mhm.
of origin where there's like bad stuff happening, right? Or ugly stuff too. So it's not always directly to us, but can can be like the underbelly of things.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. What would you add to that?
Well, when you were talking about chronic illness, I was also thinking about I know it's pretty specific, but in San Antonio, we have, I mean, there's like a lot of public health
Mhm.
kind of epidemics, and a lot of those are related to diabetes, hypertension, and a lot of the people that I don't want to say a lot, but like a good amount of people have mentioned, the traumatic experience of having to have some, whether it's like part of their foot amputated or some type of amputation. Um, and I think in like a concept that's, part of like treatment overall,
Mhm.
um, keeping them healthy or keeping them safe, but it's still this I've only worked with a couple of people who have had that experience, but how complicated that is because there's functions still, right? There's other functions, but there's this one piece that just feels so different. And there's um also it comes with even shame and it comes with um guilt. And I think that as we talk about like traumatic, that's a big piece to it with traumatic experiences is sometimes the shame or the blame or the guilt. And I think there's a lot of education to be done there, and there's a lot of support to be done there. But if we can have those conversations, and provide support to people going through something like that, because that is, that could be really traumatic for someone.
Absolutely, absolutely. I also put something as you were talking about. I had two thoughts while you were talking. The first one, there's a scene, there's an episode of Grey's Anatomy where Arizona Robin, she's a pediatrician, she loses one of her legs,
Hmm.
and there's this just like a storyline of watching her wrestle with that. And
Mm-hmm.
there's just this one scene because you can lose a limb and have what's called as phantom pain. So it feels like you're still having pain in the limb that might have been amputated. And so in the show, there's this scene where you sit, like you kind of trick your brain. So she sat in front of a long mirror to make it look like she still had both of her legs. And that
Mm-hmm.
helped like soothe some of the phantom pain. But I think it was like really healing for her too to be able to like process that. So that's what I thought of. Um, and that the second thought just se me escapó. It was about traumatic grief. Oh my gosh, I can't remember.
I think
Oh, go ahead, go ahead, go ahead.
don't lose the thought.
Okay, I
But
got it, I got it.
yeah, I think just so much of this is it feels so private too, and I think
Mhm,
that's what makes it harder sometimes to process. Something health related. I also think of women who go through miscarriages, the trauma of the physical trauma of the body, but then also um kind of the expectations of people around them, or again, like it's so private and there's so much complicated feelings around shame or blame or guilt. And how, but going back to like how even our body sometimes doesn't know how to make sense of things where someone's body might still like continue like shifting as if it were, carrying a pregnancy. And
mhm,
I think it's just so interesting sometimes that mind body connection and um how it manifests. And
mhm,
again, these conversations are important for that reason, right? If it is something that I feel like I can't share anyone, there's not an understanding or an awareness. It just kind of makes it harder to support people in situations like that.
absolutely. Um, and I also think that with that, I think like as a society, we struggle with grief, especially like outward expressions of grief. And I think in a lot of like Western cultures, I mean, I think about there's other cultures where they do like in the Jewish community, right? They sit Shiva, right? And so
Hmm.
they sit for, I don't know the amount of days, but they just sit and mourning, right? There's a mourning period. And I think that a lot of culture in the Western world, we don't really do that anymore. We don't really plan for that. And so there is like almost like this expectation that something happens and it actually causes a lot of grief, especially traumatic grief. And I'm supposed to just get over it. I'm supposed to just move on. Like I'm just supposed to show up to work on Monday like
Mm,
everything is fine when in reality for a lot of us our world has been tilted in one way or another.
yeah, yeah.
I think about in my own life there's been two kind of experiences like around that. It was like once my mother-in-law died, obviously like in my memory in my world, like there feels like there was a before and after time.
Mhm.
And like kind of moving into this after time, like I just could not imagine going back to work. Like I just could not figure how I'm supposed to kind of
Mhm.
get dressed and like show up. And I was teaching at the time and teaching.
Yeah,
Um
yeah.
And then the other part was we had a friend who lost his family pretty traumatically. And so my husband and I, he's a really good friend of ours. My husband and I went to help serve the family. They live in a different state. And it was like I mean, there was like news about it and all that stuff, but like this family member of his lost most of her family in this accident. And so I remember just getting back to my old job and they were like, okay, you don't get any grief leave around this because this is not even your
Yes.
direct
Mhm.
family. And I'm like, I don't even think you understand what I experienced.
Right,
Like
right.
it wasn't even my family, I mean, my friend feels like my family, like he's my brother.
Mhm.
And also like it wasn't necessarily my direct family. And I still had a lot of collective like grief around that.
Mhm. Yeah.
Um,
Yes, a lot of like I think in the corporate world, but also in maybe in education, a lot of spaces
mhm,
really, there's almost these tiers, right? Like tier one, tier two. And um I know of people who work at places where it's if it's like immediate family, you get this amount of time. If it's like extended family, this. If it's anything else, it's either denied or you almost like have to prove why they're important to you. And
mhm,
that's just so it's so inhumane, honestly,
mhm,
because that is oh man, if we were given the space to work through these feelings and to really move through it and be able to have that reset, we can go back, with more insight and more presence in the work we do.
mhm.
But it's just like, no, it got to rush through it. And then, then we see burnout and then we see people kind of processing it in unhealthier ways. And
Mhm.
yeah, just so
That's
much to be, so much work to be done.
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. The another type of grief is migratory grief. And so this is the kind of the grief that comes from your leaving your home, your culture, your language, especially when you're moving into maybe a culture that's very radically different than yours. Um, and kind of in some of the research I've read around migratory grief, and I think there's an overlap with other kinds of grief too, but it's always like an active grief,
Hmm.
um, especially because it's not like someone passed away and I don't have access to them anymore. But right,
Hmm.
like in some ways, like I still have a lot of access to that, even if I'm not living there. And so it can feel at times like there's an open wound. Um,
Yeah, I have experience with my own family, um, of the time that passes between seeing one another. And we see it on social media sometimes, those reunion videos of adult children reuniting with their elderly parents. And it's always so bittersweet because obviously, it's they got to see each other, and, they're together, but the time of maybe they left when they were adolescents, young adults, and now they're grown, now their children are grown, and just how much time also gets lost in that. And that also comes with grief of, you know, I only will see you like for this amount of time now. So it's yeah, but also so I mentioned this in previous episodes, but I do psychological evaluations for people going through different immigration processes. And part of the assessment talks about or asks, what was a acculturation or adjustment period like for you? And oftentimes people talk about, well, I went from a community that was very social, even if you don't know someone, you know, buenos dias, if you're at the restaurant, provecho, you could just connect with people like at the market or connect with your neighbors. And then they come here and nobody looks at each other in the eyes. Everyone's really isolated or quiet. There's just no warmth. And that's kind of like a common theme that gets brought up is how lonely it is, not just because of the language barrier, but just how different socially and culturally life can be here, especially if they're coming here by themselves, as opposed to people coming maybe for school or coming with their families. Um, it's it it is traumatic. It is traumatic, and it is, grief.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. I I'm I mean I have one type of immigration experience. And some may not even call it an immigration experience, but basically I moved here from Puerto Rico, and um I do have like American birthright and whatnot. So it can be pretty easy to move through, but it's very expensive. It can be very
Mhm.
expensive, and I can never drive there. Like that's
Yeah,
never an
yeah.
option.
Hmm.
But I'm coming from a different language, like a different culture. So it's probably more similar to Hawaii, where they have their own unique, I mean, all states have like their own culture. But for example, for Hawaii, they have like a very distinct culture. There's not maybe as much, at least for Puerto Rico, there's not as much individualism. There's like more of that collectivist feel. So it feels very different. All that to say, it feels very different.
Yeah.
And yeah, and like that kind, I remember moving here. I moved here when I was 18 to go to school, and that point of like people were not warm. They were not warm. They did not want to be friends. They
Mm-mm.
did not want to, like, we sat in class together, and it would become very transactional about like maybe sharing notes and like checking in on each other like in class, but like never anything else.
Mm-hmm.
I just remember, yeah, I just like remember feeling like so sad about that and so heartbroken about that. And I think like at least for me, I always, and I think a lot of folks feel this, right? Like this idea of ni de aquí ni de allá,
Mm-hmm.
um, where it um, it always, even though this is my home, it always feels like it's not always like 100% my home.
Mm-hmm.
That there's always a part of me that lives in Puerto Rico. And there
Yeah.
is something about being on my homeland that
Mhm.
like kind of brings alive a part of me. And I'm not fully at home there either anymore.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that causes its own kind of like grief. Because it does really feel like there isn't like there's no place I can really hold all my parts.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and I don't necessarily know that that's like a unique experience just to migration. I think it can be like with move, it can be around a lot of different things, but I think that that's always active. Like there's not really a resolution for that. There's not really like, um, yeah, like it will always just be that way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and so I think that's like when we talk about it being like an active type
Mm-hmm.
of grief.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah.
I know we talked a little bit about like health related grief.
Mhm.
I think I would just add to that. sometimes like the lifestyle or changes in lifestyle that are required to either accommodate or support, treatment. And sometimes that looks like, um, you know, less opportunities for socialization. Maybe that looks like not moving your body in the ways that you used to like doing.
Mhm.
Um, and therefore not doing some of the activities you like to do. It can kind of coincide with depression as well,
Mhm.
because it does require, these changes in what you thought you could do or thought you were going to be able to do versus a reality now, on top of the
Mhm.
sometimes physical pain, and
Mhm.
limitations that come with that.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah. Yeah.
mm,
That's another big one. Um, and also like sometimes even coming to terms with like what is.
mm,
Like if you have chronic illness, it's chronic for a reason, right? Like you'll probably struggle with it for the rest of your life, if not most of your life.
mhm.
Um, and that comes with its own kind of grief. Um,
Um,
Go ahead.
Okay. And to say some other ones can be, again, a lot of these can overlap, but relational grief can be another one. So I know I mentioned a breakup or a divorce, can also be like a friendship kind of growing in different directions.
Mhm.
Um, Pet loss. Um, our pets, for many of us, our pets are our children or family members, and they often see, people through important parts of their lives.
Mhm.
um and so that can feel like that is a real loss of, this being who is with alongside me for so
Mhm.
long, and now there's a hole where they were, so
Yeah.
those sort of things can also come with the territory of either ambiguous grief,
Mhm.
um just relational grief, and even collective grief.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Let me tell you, when my dog Kia dies, we're going to be a mess in our household. A mess. Last last night we got home, we went out for like a ride or whatever, and we got home and it was like so cute. Like she just had to say hello to both of us. And I was carrying all these motetes. And so my husband was trying to get her attention because he bought her a toy. But like she followed me through the house to just say hello. And as soon as she got her little scratches and I acknowledged her and she did whatever she does, she ran back out. I was like, the sweet girl. So so that pet loss is huge. And I think I've even seen in clients who like they don't even realize that they like, and this kind of moves us into our next one, like delayed grief,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
where it doesn't happen in the moment and then it hits, can be months, years
Mm-hmm.
later. When it might be like re-triggered or you might have like capacity in your nervous system to deal with it. Um, and so for pets, I think that's a big one because we don't necessarily in society, we don't necessarily always like give space for people to feel grief around their pets.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
I would say even culturally too. I know that um when our Chihuahua Lily passed away, that some people were like, "Well, just get another dog, just get another dog, or it was just a dog." And it's part of, in Mexico too, you see a lot of strays, and it's almost just like, oh, it's part of the landscape almost.
mhm,
It's just a dog. Um, and so, but you experience it and it is again, but it's not just a dog, it's, a family member. Um,
mhm,
I'm going to jump ahead to one of the books I wanted to bring up. But you mentioned the delayed grief. So there's a book that I've recommended to people who've been through, particularly pet loss, and it's called Griffin's Heart. And it's written by this woman who lost her cat. Of cats live a long time,
they do live a long
but
time.
I think hers was in the teens, somewhere in the teens, and so saw her through a lot of like moves, a lot of jobs, relationships, and when she lost him, at first it was just like, okay, well, I guess like I go back to my normal life and just kind of keep it going. And then she fell into a pretty deep depression, but she couldn't understand why. That, like, generally her life looked good and felt good. And it wasn't until she went to therapy and they identified this was like a significant loss for her, and she just hadn't been able to almost give herself permission to grieve it as that loss. And so in Griffin's Heart, she created it as a way for other people to process it. And there's I didn't bring my copy, but it has sections for like journal prompts, places to put pictures of like shared memories. It has a few like therapeutic exercises, but it helps. And it's also designed in a way to go at your own pace. Um, so you don't, obviously don't have to sit down and do everything in like a week. It's, little by little. And I myself used it when Lily passed away, and I still haven't completed it. It's just every now and then I'll work through it. But it's just also a good like keepsake. But yeah, delayed grief when it comes to any ambiguous loss, I think, or any loss really. Um, Sometimes our brain protects us in a moment of intense emotion, just so we can sort of survive or function. But once maybe things settle down, or when our brain has that capacity, that's when things tend to show up. So also knowing it, sometimes our brain is trying to do what it thinks is best in those hard moments.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think there's a big part of it too that has to do with like even socialization. There's a interesting video on YouTube, and it's a group of men talking about masculinity and manhood. And
Mhm.
so one of the guys shares that when his, I don't know if it was his abuela passed away or his cousin or something, how like he didn't even cry because of like how frowned upon that was, just in like the Latino men, and
Mhm.
what's expected of them. And it didn't hit him until years later, where he had like a major breakdown around like the mourning of
Mhm.
this person.
Yeah.
So that can be like a delayed
Mhm.
grief.
Mhm.
And then to kind of wrap, there's other types of grief too. We've hit a lot of the big ones, but we can also have what's called prolonged or complicated grief. And so this is when grief according to the DSM. So according to the book that we do the diagnosing with, it's grief that feels stuck after a year.
Mhm.
So understanding that, especially for relational grief, grief doesn't just go away, it shifts. Sometimes I'll talk about it feeling a little bit more well behaved than it
Mhm.
did at the beginning,
Mhm.
but it doesn't necessarily always go away. But but it shouldn't be after about a year. It shouldn't be debilitating or paralyzing.
Mhm. Mhm.
And you might have moments of that, but it shouldn't be necessarily an everyday kind
Mhm.
of situation.
Mhm.
And so that's when it gets a little bit more complicated. Complicated grief can also happen when there's like a lot of stuff going on, or there's a
Yeah.
lot of grief going on. So,
Mhm.
you hear stories of they lose their grandmother, and then they lose their mom, and then they lose their pet all within 8 months.
Yeah.
And so
Mhm.
that can lead to complicated grief because there's so much grief, and we can only take so much at a given
Mhm.
time.
Yeah. Well, now that we've kind of gone over it, moral of the story, right there, all grief kind of is valid, right? I
Yeah.
think that's a big piece is um there's so many ways to experience it, and it is valid. But how do we move through it from a cultural lens? What are some ways or practices that we can like move through those feelings? So it's, wanting to explore that a little bit in our conversation today. I can share a little bit about how in my family's culture, we've kind of tended to move through, moments of grief. But I know there's so many other practices, and you talked to me about one during our preparation that I'm very, again, curious to talk about today. But one that in our household we've done are novenas. So novenas are 9 days where you pray a rosary for the person who's passed away. And you usually gather at either the home of the immediate family, or someone, offers to host, or sometimes it's at the church. And for 9 days, you gather together, you pray the rosary, and then at the end, there's some type of meal or pan or, coffee. And people will just kind of talk about the person or talk to each other about what things have been feeling like. But in that time of prayer, the idea is, right, and this is from kind of like Mexican Catholic lens, right? But it's praying that the soul is transitioning through, to heaven, and kind of that our prayers are guiding their soul to heaven. And for a lot of, especially the older family members, that can feel really comforting, right? Grief can make us feel powerless. And that is one way I've seen bring comfort to people. Like, I can't change what is, but maybe I can influence what can be still happening for them, which I think is a really beautiful kind of
Yeah.
idea. Um, we don't do this, but I know that in other parts of Mexico or other, you know, because there's so many subcultures, right? But I know in some areas they make it a big party with like a whole like live band, banda, or mariachi. Sometimes they'll like take a shot of tequila and pour some tequila on their coffin. They're singing, but that singing also can have it's almost like an expression of grief, puedes dar un grito, un llanto, but it's almost pairing with this um, creative expression, or this just expression of emotion. And it also teaches that loss and celebration of life, right? Those things can coexist.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, so we don't tend to do that, but I've seen it happen. And again,
Mhm.
it's a way of comfort and connection, and a hope, for that person.
Mhm.
And then of course, Dia de Muertos in different Latin cultures. For us, usually looks, and we've talked about it in a past episode, but it's the altar, the pan de muerto, the deceased ones' favorites, favorite foods, favorite drinks, favorite items. And it's also cyclical, right? So it's once a year where um you can still look forward to having the presence of that person just be felt a little bit more around that time in November.
Mhm.
So it's kind of almost a little check-in with how are you with your grief.
Mhm.
Um, yes. What
Well, yeah.
anything that you would want to share about?
Um, I think I haven't done any of these things. So my family isn't Catholic, so we haven't done novenas. I do think it's like pretty popular in the Catholic Church.
Mhm.
My family in particular hasn't necessarily partaken. We Puerto Rico a couple maybe like a decade ago, we got kind of put in the news for what's called muertos parados. And so basically, in the embalming process, they would embalm people in motion. So it would be, I personally feel a certain kind of way about it, but I have my own stuff around funerals and whatnot. But like the guy that kind of like was like made popular was like instead of being in a casket, he's riding his motorcycle. Or like there's like a man like sitting in his house, and it's like they recreated like the corner of his casita, and like there's like music playing um and all that. And so it's like a really expensive but also really like um oh my gosh, complex like embalming
Yeah.
process to make them like stand or be in whatever motion. And I think like the heart of it is like how like to remember them doing what they loved, right?
Mhm.
Like to honor like their like I guess like their humanity in a way that feels not like they're just like laying in a coffin, but rather
Right.
like that there's a little bit of like aliveness in memory.
Mhm.
Um, and so they're called muertos parados. We also, some of the other things that I've kind of seen has been like, we don't always wear black to funerals. For my
Mhm.
grandmother's funeral, we actually all wore white, um, as a kind of as a family. Um, so that's not always as maybe the custom. Sometimes people give out like pictures of the deceased. Um, I just got to preface that I feel a little weird about all this stuff. Like, I know we do it culturally, but I feel a little weird about it. But yeah, so they'll like hand out pictures of them in their coffin or whatnot. And
And I think, back to how we move through grief, where maybe one culture
mhm,
is almost like reserved about it, and on another extreme, it's like very in your face about it. It's a spectrum, right? And people can
yeah,
land wherever on that spectrum,
yeah,
in a way that feels uh right for
for
them,
them. Yeah.
and where there's capacity.
Hmm.
Because right, when we say everyone grieves differently, it
Hmm.
really means
It
differently.
really means that. Yeah.
And it doesn't mean that right, that you
Hmm.
do or don't care one way or another. It's what felt authentic to your relationship with the person or the
Hmm.
situation, and honoring
Absolutely.
it in that way.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We also, one of the things I do like enjoy, if you want to use that really loosely, is a lot of the funerals or vigils or viewings is a very communal. So,
Mm-hmm.
um, like, like, so let's say your abuela passes away. It would be very common for me and my husband to go,
Mm-hmm.
right? To go to the funeral, even though we may have never met your abuela,
Mm-hmm.
um, because it's about like community. And
Yeah,
so lots of people will go to a viewing or funeral, even if it's like very, very removed.
right.
One of my friends in high school, maybe it was middle school, her dad unfortunately passed away. And
Mm-hmm.
so I went to school in a really, really small town. So we like literally just walked over to the funeral home. So we made a
Mm-hmm.
class field trip to the
Oh,
funeral
wow.
home to sit with our friend in that.
Wow.
And so my
Mhm.
grandmother like knew my friend, but didn't necessarily like know her dad. And so we're there and my abuela shows up because it's within walking distance of her house. And come to find out that we're related through marriage because my abuela saw someone. It was like a
Really?
whole thing, but um it's just very common practice that like if someone you love or care about, one of their family members may have passed away, we go to honor them and sit with them. And so you'll have a lot of people show up that you haven't seen for a long time, where it's like, I met your mama one time and she really impacted or whatever. And so I just came here
Mm,
to support. And I really do like love that.
yeah.
That it is not just reserved for like the invited or,
Hmm.
it's you'll see a lot of folks come through. Um, and so I do really appreciate that. I don't think we do that as much here.
Right,
Um,
right.
yeah. But yeah, I think to your point, like, yeah, we all have different versions of how we want to do that and what feels like helpful and whatnot. And um, my husband and I have our own stuff and around what we like to do when we go to funerals or what we don't like to do or whatever.
Yeah,
Because I think like the yeah, like you said, grief is very, very personalized and individual.
yeah.
And so kind of
Um,
go ahead.
I feel like
I
we're
would,
I was excited to move through the
yeah,
conversation. I was just
yeah.
gonna say that as we're talking about like how to maybe where to
Hmm.
start as a way to kind of, if you do, as you're listening to the conversation and maybe you realize maybe there's situations that I still haven't leaned into or gone back to, or I'm still struggling with, but don't know maybe where to start. Um, Kind of like I mentioned earlier with the journal, that's a way to navigate one type of loss in kind of a contained way, right? With the
Mhm.
journal and the mementos and the memory box. And so I had a couple other resources, and then, we can continue talking about like how does one move move through and cope with grief. But a couple resources. I know I mentioned Griffin's Heart for Pet Loss. Another one is the 52-week grief journal. And that one is what it sounds like, right? Once a week, there is a set of questions, a reflection, and a way to honor the person that has passed. And um it's like there's a gentle and slow build to things. So like the first week is, can you maybe give your grief a color or a shape, um, and help you contextualize your grief in a way that doesn't feel so maybe vague or foreign. It's like, okay, I'm kind of putting something to this and like, externalizing it. And then it'll talk about like anniversaries and holidays. But I found that one to be gentle, but also practical in a way that maybe I don't want to sit with this like all at once, but I can break it down little by little. Um, and then I know there's a couple of like videos on YouTube as well that talk about um, people moving through grief. In Spanish, there's another podcast called Se Regalan Dudas, and they also talk about their experiences with grief and loss, and they'll bring in, different professionals to talk about it. Um, and I think books and movies are also a good way to have almost like a cathartic moment, or
Mhm.
um, put kind of a visual to your experience. So I know the movie Coco is that for a lot of people, where there's so many gems in that movie about keeping someone's memory alive, um, how we can still have connection with people even when they're not physically here, how family can support one another in those moments. So that's such a sweet movie,
Mhm.
but very stirring. I would say Steel Magnolias is another one where it talks about this collective grief where this town loses a very special person. And there's a really beautiful funeral scene where the mom, who was very stoic, during the process, at the end, when she's safe with her friends, she just kind of lets it out and she's
Mhm.
like, why? Like, why her? And there's humor in there and there's support in there. So I think that's another one. And then with like health related or anticipatory grief, there's this series on Hulu called Dying for Sex with Michelle Williams, the actress, and she plays a character. It's based on a true story, actually. She's plays a character who's been diagnosed with, I think it's breast cancer. Um, and like she has a pretty short prognosis, but it's on her bucket list to kind of explore her sexuality in different ways. And it's about friendship, it's about again, coming to terms with something that big. And it's a really, just really, really beautiful series. So those are some resources,
Mhm.
if you are looking for somewhere to start exploring this topic.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are great. I love Coco um for that. It was like such a, I think, helpful just like analogy or just like
Yeah.
to see it witnessed like that. I think like really we're coming to the end of the podcast, but I do want to touch on just like really briefly of like what are some ways that I can, I start with these resources and maybe you're like, I don't want to do a journal or whatever. Like sometimes movies are really hard after
Mhm.
This is so dumb. After my mother-in-law passed away, like I don't know what happened, but we kept picking movies where their mom died.
Oh.
And so for some reason we ended up watching, I think, Stepmother with Julia Roberts and Susan
Mm.
Sarandon. Big mistake. It's a great movie, but she
Yeah,
does die.
the timing was off.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Spoiler alert, she does die.
Oh.
The timing. So some of the things like really quickly, sometimes I'll suggest to clients and something we practice in our home are just like rituals, or just having like some like specific things that we do to honor. So my mother-in-law loved birds, and so anytime we have like any kind of gathering and we like are decorating the house, we always put a bird on the table, like so a little. I don't have any with me right now, but like a little, we collect like little
Mm.
statues, from Hobby Lobby or wherever. Um, for some folks, like even just like prayer or the lighting of candles, for folks can be really helpful. Um, we like whenever big anniversaries come around or hard days, sometimes we'll do like remembrance things. So we'll
Mm.
pull out pictures or we'll talk about their favorite food or their favorite memory or our favorite memory with them, um, as a way to just like honor like the memory or honor them. Um, I some of this is like what I recommend, and some of it is like stuff that we practice personally, but just like preparing for hard days. So,
Hmm.
like in March, is when my mother-in-law passed away, early March. And so we just have made it a point to just like take the day off, or to be really mindful of like how we talk to one another.
Hmm.
And this year was like maybe one of our, like the first year, this was year 5, was the first year it didn't feel as sharp.
Mm. Hmm.
And so it didn't feel as debilitating as it has in previous years. But in previous years, like we're laying in bed all day.
Mm. Yeah.
And so just like giving ourselves space for that, I think is really important. So like not trying to force myself to work,
Right.
right?
Hmm.
So we just at this point we just take the day off and whatever kind of comes. Like if we wake up and feel good, we just kind of go about whatever.
Hmm.
And if we wake up and we don't feel good, we give ourselves permission to grieve that and lay around the house if we need to lay around the
Yeah.
house.
Yeah. Hmm.
Um, the other one is like practicing mindfulness. And, I think like what makes grief really unique is that grief, because it kind of sticks around forever, in some way or another, that it's really about making space for it more than it is about like, sure, we can practice some deep breathing, we can do some grounding, and grief doesn't like bend to that in the same way
Hmm.
anxiety does.
Hmm.
So just like letting the emotions come and go as they please. Like I can't even tell you how many times like I'm in the kitchen, like I'm cooking, and then all of a sudden a memory hits me and I'm also crying, right?
Yeah.
And tears are falling into the potatoes, and
Yeah.
just kind of letting that be what it is. Like, right, like not needing to fix that moment, not necessarily needing, sometimes it's obviously appropriate to step back, but sometimes it's just is what it is and it's gonna come and it's gonna go. And so giving ourselves space
Right.
to do that. Anything
Hmm.
else you would add to that list?
Um, I would say expectations. Yeah, managing expectations. I think with holidays, you mentioned Mother's Day, Father's Day coming up. Um, totally okay to not want to be on social media for a few days. Um, you don't want to maybe be around certain people, it's kind of like a prepare ahead plan.
Mhm.
Um, so sort of managing expectations for yourself that I don't
Mhm.
have to do or feel a certain way. I think also with like holidays or anniversaries, it doesn't also have to be about that day either. I think sometimes it's like, well, this is a big day for this reason, so I need to make a thing out of it. And some days it's just like I'll be mindful of today, but I can also maybe make time for, you know. doing something I want to do, or just having a conversation with someone. It doesn't maybe have to be the focal point. Um, just because there's maybe a feeling or a sense of obligation. It's also let me give myself permission to notice what is present and move through it as needed.
Definitely. As far as the counseling part comes along, like, you know, for us as therapists, what I'm looking for is like kind of at that 1 year mark. If we're not
Mm-hmm.
seeing symptoms, like I say, the grief become a little bit more well behaved in
Mm-hmm.
terms
Mm-hmm.
of she's not like wreaking havoc all the time.
Yeah.
Just like sometimes, right? Like that might be a great time to come in, but just know that I think that for grief, it can be really helpful to just have someone to be able to hold space for that,
Mm-hmm.
especially when you might be going through like some like less socially acceptable griefs.
Mm-hmm.
Like a big one is like like pregnancy loss. Like
Mm-hmm.
people don't get it when they don't live it out,
Mm-hmm.
right? And there's like almost an expectation that you kind of like, okay, it's been like 4 weeks, get over it. Like,
Right. Right.
and that kind of grief doesn't work that way, especially for women.
Mm-hmm.
And so it can always be an appropriate place to like come see us and just come talk to us, and we can hold space for some of that to just make sure you're grieving well and that the grief isn't becoming complicated grief.
Mm-hmm.
But with that being said, if even in like that first year, if you are starting to see like some depression settle in, right? Beyond maybe it's hard to put like a timeline on this, right? But beyond the maybe the first like 4 months,
Mm-hmm.
that
Mm-hmm.
you're starting to see some depression settle in, or like suicidal thoughts
Mm-hmm.
are coming up, or self-harm, that would also be a great time to come talk to us.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes an antidepressant can be really helpful in one of these instances, to just like to help take the edge off. So that might be an appropriate referral too. Um, but just knowing like it's very hard, and there will be days like it's very hard to get out of bed. But if it's going on maybe a little too long, or there's like a deep turn afterwards, that would be a great time to come talk to
Mm-hmm.
someone or talk to your doctor.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, thank you guys so much. This was like a little bit of a sadder episode. Grief is definitely a hard one, and kind of like I mentioned, I think grief cannot, not always, but regularly be attached to love.
Mm-hmm.
And just love for our pets, our family members, for different parts of our lives, for humanity, right? Like just like when we feel grief around world events, just like
Yeah.
having a love for our brother or sister in terms of
Mm-hmm.
humanity. Um, and that grief is the kind of the reminder of like, hey, this matters. This
Mm-hmm.
person matters. This matters. There's a really good song by Johnny Swim, and it's called Let It Matter.
Mm-hmm.
And basically the line is like if it matters, let it matter, right? Just kind of
Mm-hmm.
giving us permission to let it happen.
Yeah.
The It's a duo, and the wife is oh my gosh, I can't think of her mom's name. Donna Summers. It's Donna
Mm.
Summers' daughter, right?
Oh,
And so that so she's part of the duo. So, and like you're right, Donna Summers passed away, and
yeah.
um it's kind of a really beautiful, I think, like
Mm.
tribute to her.
Mm.
Um, so yeah, so grief again, it's going to touch all of us at one point or another, and it's something you don't have to walk through alone. There's a lot of great resources and a lot of great therapists that would love to sit with you in that. And so, if you are needing some extra support around your grief, please feel free to visit our website, canentacenter.com. If you're needing low and reduced services, visit our foundation, canentafoundation.org. And more recently, I don't know, hopefully this is going to air before then. On May 16th, we have our self-care summit. And this year we are talking about cultural healing practices. So kind of returning to our roots. So we're going to talk about movement and food and limpias, and just like some of the things that we have practiced generationally through our culture for healing. And so we would love to see you there. If you're in Dallas, that's May 16th, which you can find more information on our website, connectedfoundation.org.